You are standing on a dirt street, not a paved street, not a cobblestone street, not a street with sidewalks and crosswalks, and the various amenities that the word street implies to the modern mind. A dirt street, a street that is dust in dry weather and mud in wet weather, and that is currently in the August heat of 1876, somewhere between the two. The surface packed hard by wagon wheels and horse hooves into a substance that is technically soil but functions more like concrete in the ruts, and more like talcum powder in the spots where the wheels haven't pressed it flat. The street is in a town. The town is in the American West. And the American West, in 1876, is a place that the popular imagination has been processing for approximately 150 years and has still not quite gotten right. The Wild West of the movies and the television shows and the paperback novels is a place of magnificent landscapes, heroic gunfighters, loyal horses, and moral clarity. The good guys wear white hats and shoot straight and win. The bad guys wear black hats and die in the final reel. The saloons are full of beautiful women and convenient fights. The frontier is a place of freedom and possibility, where a man with a gun and a dream can carve out his destiny from the raw material of an untamed continent. This version of the Wild West is not entirely wrong. The landscapes are real. They are genuinely magnificent in ways that the camera captures inadequately. The freedom and possibility were real for certain categories of people, at certain moments, under certain conditions. The guns were real. The fights were real. But the Wild West, as most people actually experienced it. The working cowboys, the farmers, the merchants, the indigenous peoples, whose world was being dismantled in real time, the Chinese laborers building the railroads, the women running the boarding houses, and the laundries, and occasionally the saloons, was something considerably more complicated, considerably more exhausting, and considerably more dangerous than the cinematic version suggests. You are standing on the dirt street of a real town in the real West in 1876, and you have arrived here from the modern world with the specific set of expectations that 150 years of Western mythology has given you. And those expectations are about to be adjusted, comprehensively, in ways that will begin with the smell. The smell is the first thing. The American West of 1876 smelled like horses. Not metaphorically, literally constantly, the smell of horse manure and horse urine and the specific organic richness of large animals. In large numbers was the background olfactory experience of every town, every trail, every camp, every working environment of the period. A town of 1,000 people in 1876 might have several hundred horses, mules, and oxen in and around it at any given time, and several hundred large animals produce waste at a rate that the period's sanitation infrastructure, which was minimal, could not manage. The street you are standing on has horse manure on it. Several deposits, in various stages of aging, contributed by the traffic that has been moving up and down this street since before you arrived. The boots that you will need to be wearing to function in this environment, the heavy leather boots that are the period's practical footwear, are going to become acquainted with at least one of these deposits before the morning is over, in a moment that the cinematic version of the West consistently omits. Welcome to the Wild West, the real one. Let's talk about how long you would actually last in it. Not very long is the short answer, but the reasons are more interesting than you might expect, and the details of the Wild West that the mythology skips over are genuinely extraordinary in ways that the myth, in its obsession with the gunfight and the sunset, manages to miss entirely. Chapter 5. 1. The geography, the scale of the problem, and why distance alone could kill you. The West is enormous. This is the first thing that kills people who don't understand it, and it kills them not through dramatic violence, but through the patient, indifferent mathematics of distance and time. The American West is not a backdrop. It is not the scenic landscape behind the dramatic action. It is the dominant fact of every situation that occurs within it, and its scale is genuinely difficult to process from the perspective of the modern person who crosses it in 3 hours, in a pressurized tube at 35,000 feet. The distance between Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, two of the Wild West's most mythologized locations, is approximately 900 miles. In 1876, traveling by horse at the reasonable rate of 25 to 30 miles per day that a horse can sustain without being destroyed, this journey takes approximately a month. A month of riding through terrain that includes the southern plains, the desert southwest, and the various geographical features between them, in weather that ranges from the merely brutal to the actively lethal depending on the season. This is not the distance between two neighborhoods. This is not even the distance between two cities. This is the distance between 2 points in a space so large that the human mind evolved for environments where you can see the next hill and know what's on the other side of it, doesn't have the appropriate cognitive framework for processing it. The West's scale was one of its primary killers, and it killed through dehydration, starvation, exposure, and the specific despair of people who had run out of food or water, or both, and were still several days from the nearest place where those things could be obtained. The water problem was the first specific way that the West's geography killed people who didn't know it. The American West, particularly the Southwest and the Great Basin, is one of the driest inhabited regions on Earth, and the distribution of water across its surface is wildly uneven. There are places where water is reliably available, and there are places where the nearest water source is 2 days' ride away. And knowing which places were, which was survival knowledge that the experienced Westerner possessed, and the newcomer did not. The experienced cowboy or scout or indigenous person traveling through the West carried water and knew where to find more. They knew which creek beds held water even in August, which springs were reliable and which were seasonal, which direction led to water, and how far away it was from any given point. This knowledge was accumulated through years of experience in specific landscapes and was as locally specific as it was critical. The knowledge of where the water was in the Sonoran Desert was not transferable to the Great Basin without the specific relearning that the new landscape required. You do not have this knowledge. You have arrived in 1876 from the modern world, and your knowledge of water comes from the experience of a world where water comes from taps and is available at gas stations and grocery stores and the various commercial outlets that the modern infrastructure provides. The specific life or death knowledge of where the water is in a landscape, where the absence of it kills you in approximately 3 days, this knowledge you do not have. The heat compounds the water problem in ways that the cinematic West consistently underrepresents. The summer temperatures of the American Southwest, the region where so much of the Wild West mythology is set, routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius, and in the direct sun on a day with no shade and no wind, the effective temperature is significantly higher. A person working in this heat requires several liters of water per day to maintain basic physiological function. A person not working, simply existing, requires at least 2 liters. A person who doesn't have this water begins experiencing the specific physiological deterioration of heat exhaustion within hours, and heat stroke within a day, and heat stroke in the desert Southwest in 1876, where the nearest doctor is potentially 2 days away, is almost always fatal. The cold was the winter version of the same problem. The American West has a temperature range that the coastal populations of the modern United States find genuinely shocking. The northern plains, which seem like moderate grassland in the summer photographs, experience winter temperatures of -30 to -40 Celsius, with winds that make the effective temperature lower still. The blizzards of the northern plains, the storms that the indigenous people of the region had names for that reflected their specific ferocity, arrived with a speed that could trap the unprepared traveler in the open with hours rather than days of warning. The blizzard of 1888, slightly after our period but representative of the weather that the northern plains produced regularly, arrived on a January afternoon when the temperature dropped from above, freezing to -30 in a matter of hours, with winds that produced zero visibility. 235 people died in that storm, many of them caught outside within a quarter mile of shelter, unable to find it in the whiteout conditions. The West killed people who were close to safety as readily as it killed people who were far from it, because close to safety in a blizzard was not the same as being inside safety. The terrain was the third dimension of the geography's lethality. The American West contains some of the most extreme terrain on the continent. The canyon systems of the Colorado Plateau, where a wrong turn meant a vertical drop of several hundred meters. The mountain passes of the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada that were impassable for months each year, and that in the wrong season were death traps for the party that started too late or moved too slowly. The Donner Party of 1846 to 47, the immigrant group that was trapped by early snow in the Sierra Nevada and resorted to cannibalism to survive, was not a story of exceptional bad luck. It was a story of the West's terrain making its standard lethal argument at the standard time of year against a party whose timing had been slightly off. You are standing in a town, which means you are, by the West's standards, in the safest possible location. The town being specifically the node of infrastructure and supply that existed to provide the resources that the West's geography made otherwise unavailable. But the town is surrounded by the geography, and the geography is always present as both the fact of life and the threat of death that the West's inhabitants navigated every day. The navigation itself was a skill. The West of 1876 was not comprehensively mapped. There were maps, increasingly good ones, as the government surveys of the post-Civil War period produced their results. But the maps available to the ordinary traveler were imperfect in ways that the landscape's complexity made dangerous. The traveler who could read the landscape, who could navigate by the sun and the stars, and the specific topographical features of the terrain, had an advantage that the traveler who could only read a map didn't possess, because the map's errors were sometimes in the places where the terrain's errors were most consequential. The trail was the West's primary navigation technology, the established routes between water sources and settlements that had been identified, traveled, and refined through decades of indigenous use and immigrant experience. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Chisholm Trail. These were not roads in the modern sense, but simply the routes that experience had identified as the best available options, marked by the passage of previous travelers rather than by signs or infrastructure. The person who left the trail, who thought they knew a shortcut, who got disoriented in the dark, who followed a creek bed that seemed to be going in the right direction, was a person in genuine danger. The West's survivors were the people who respected the trail and its knowledge, even when the trail seemed inefficient. The West's dead often included people who had thought they could do better. Chapter 2. The Heat and the Thirst. The specific, daily violence of the Western climate. Let's get specific about the water. You are a day out of Dodge City, traveling south toward Indian Territory, on a route that the experienced hands told you was straightforward. It is July. The temperature at 10 in the morning is already 38 degrees Celsius, and the sun is high enough that the shadow of your horse, if you had a horse, which we'll address in a moment, is a small, unhelpful puddle directly underneath the animal, rather than anything you could use for shade. You have one canteen, holding approximately 1 liter of water, because that's what you grabbed when you left. 1 liter is what you need every 2 hours in this heat doing moderate activity. You have been riding for 3 hours. The math is already bad. The experienced traveler of the 1876 West carried multiple canteens, knew exactly how much water they held, and knew exactly how many miles and how many hours of travel were between them and the next reliable water source. They rationed their water with the specific, unsentimental calculation of someone who had understood the alternative. They drank before they were thirsty, the experienced desert traveler understanding that thirst was already a symptom of dehydration rather than a warning of it. And they managed their exertion to minimize water loss, traveling in the early morning and the late afternoon, and resting in the midday heat that made exertion expensive. You do not have any of these habits. You are experiencing thirst at approximately hour 2 of the journey, and you are responding to it by drinking from the canteen with the specific freedom of someone who has never been truly thirsty in their life. By hour 3, the canteen is 3/4 empty, and the horizon in every direction is the same. Flat, brown, shimmering in the heat, and entirely devoid of the water source that you are now actively hoping will appear. The symptoms of dehydration in the desert heat progress through stages that the body communicates with increasing urgency. The dry mouth and the thirst are the early stages, the comfortable warning, the body's way of saying that the situation is manageable if addressed promptly. The headache is the next stage, the specific throbbing behind the eyes that the desert sun and the dehydration produce together. The muscle cramps follow, the legs, the arms, the specific seizing of muscles that have been working in the heat without sufficient water to maintain their electrolyte balance. At this stage, in the West of 1876, you are in trouble that the environment is not going to resolve for you. There is no ambulance, there is no IV drip, there is no emergency room 2 minutes away. There is the landscape and the horse and whatever water you have left, and the specific private negotiation between your body and the heat that everyone in the West conducted daily, and that the people who survived were better at conducting than the people who didn't. The rivers and creeks of the West were not the reliable water sources that the map might suggest. The Platte River, the river that the Oregon Trail followed across Nebraska, whose name was famous enough to be one of the primary navigational features of the overland route, was described by the immigrants who traveled alongside it as a mile wide and an inch deep, its water brown with sediment and unreliable for drinking, without the filtration and boiling that the period's understanding of water safety partially addressed and partially didn't. The contaminated water source was a specific recurring danger of the West that the romanticized version skips over entirely. The creek that looked clean and ran clear might be running through a stretch of land where alkali minerals had dissolved into it, making the water poisonous to drink. The alkali water of the Great Basin and parts of the Southwest could be lethal to both animals and humans, and the stock of immigrants who drank from the wrong source died in ways that were both agonizing and confusing to people who had seen perfectly good-looking water kill their oxen. Cholera was the waterborne disease that made the overland trails into episodic death marches. The cholera epidemics that swept through the immigrant trains of the 1840s and 1850s were not random catastrophes, but the predictable result of thousands of people and animals sharing the same water sources, using the same creek beds for both water supply and waste disposal, and traveling in a world where the germ theory of disease was not yet understood, and hand washing was not yet understood as the specific hygiene measure that would have saved thousands of lives. The graves along the Oregon Trail. The estimates run to approximately 20,000 graves along the 2,000-mile route, roughly 10 graves per mile, were the visible record of the West's water situation, and the majority of them were the graves of people killed not by violence, but by disease, by exposure, by the specific patient violence of the climate against bodies that were tired, malnourished, and drinking water that was doing them as much harm as good. The practical response to the water problem that the experienced Westerner developed was a combination of knowledge, equipment, and behavioral adaptation. The knowledge of the landscape and its water sources, the equipment of multiple canteens, water barrels for wagon travel, the specific containers that the period's technology provided for, the storage and transportation of water, the behavioral adaptation of rationing, of timing travel to avoid the worst heat, of learning to read the landscape for the signs of water, the cottonwood trees that followed the creek beds even when the water was underground, the specific vegetation patterns that indicated moisture, the behavior of animals that could lead the experienced observer to water. None of these adaptations were available to you at the beginning of your first day in 1876. They were the accumulated knowledge of years of experience in the specific landscape, and the gap between not having them and having them was, in the West, often the gap between survival and its alternative. Chapter 3. The horse, your essential partner, and everything that could go wrong with it. You need a horse. This is not a romantic statement about the bond between man and animal or the nobility of the cowboy's relationship with his mount. It is a practical statement about the transportation infrastructure of the 1876 West, which was organized entirely around the horse in the way that the modern West is organized around the automobile, and whose absence left you in approximately the same situation as the modern person stranded without a car in the suburbs of Phoenix. The horse of the Wild West was not the noble, perfectly trained creature of the Hollywood Western. The animal that came when it was called, stood still when you needed it to stand still, and performed complex maneuvers in extreme situations without complaint. Real horses are large, powerful, occasionally unpredictable animals whose behavior in any specific situation was the product of their individual temperament, their training, their health, their current mood, and the specific stimuli of the environment they were in. A horse that was poorly trained would refuse commands at the moments when following them was most critical. A horse that was frightened by a sudden noise, by an unfamiliar smell, by the specific startle response that horses are neurologically prone to, could buck, bolt, or both, with consequences for the rider that ranged from the undignified to the lethal. A horse that was tired had a significantly reduced capacity for the work that the West required of it. A horse that was sick or lame was a transportation emergency in a world where the next horse was potentially many miles away. The specific skill of horsemanship, the ability to ride competently, to manage the horse in difficult terrain, to read the horse's behavior and respond to it appropriately, was not a skill that the modern person typically has. Riding a horse in a controlled environment, with a trained horse and an instructor nearby, is one experience. Riding a horse across the southern plains in the summer heat, on a route that includes creek crossings and rough terrain, and the occasional rattlesnake that might spook the animal. This is a different experience, and the difference is significant. The working cowboys of the 1870s and 1880s were among the most skilled horsemen in American history, not as a cultural choice, but as an occupational requirement. The management of cattle herds across the open range required the specific horsemanship skills of the cutting horse work, the roping, the riding through rough terrain in all weather at speed. These skills were developed over years of daily work with horses, and the cowboy who lacked them was a cowboy who couldn't do his job, and who was, in the specific situations where the skill mattered most, a danger to himself and his crewmates. The care of the horse was the other dimension of the horseman's skill that the cinematic version of the West underrepresents. The horse that was ridden hard and put away wet, the horse that was worked intensively and then not cooled down properly before being fed and watered, was a horse being set up for colic, the intestinal condition that was the leading cause of death in working horses of the period. A horse in the grip of colic was a horse in severe pain, rolling and thrashing and unable to function, and the treatment available in the 1876 West was limited and uncertain. The shoeing of horses was the other maintenance requirement that the working horse of the West needed, and that the period's infrastructure provided imperfectly. The iron shoes that protected the horse's hooves from the rocky, rough terrain of the West wore down and needed regular replacement every 4 to 6 weeks for a hard-working horse. And the availability of the blacksmith who could shoe a horse was a function of how close you were to a town of sufficient size to support one. The horse that lost a shoe in rough country, 30 miles from the nearest blacksmith, was a horse that had to be led rather than ridden for those 30 miles. And the time cost of this was paid by the rider in whatever the journey's timeline could least afford. The value of horses in the Wild West economy was accordingly high. A good working horse in the 1870s cost the equivalent of several months of a working man's wages, which made horse theft one of the most serious crimes of the period, and the subject of the frontier justice that the popular mythology has encoded into the image of the vigilante hanging. The hanged horse thief was not the cinematic exception. He was the legal and social reality of a world where the theft of a horse was not property crime in the abstract sense, but a practical threat to the owner's ability to work, travel, and survive. You need a horse, and the horse you get is going to require you to know things about horses that you probably don't know, and the consequences of not knowing them are going to be measured in miles walked and situations managed badly, and the specific incremental physical deterioration of someone whose primary transportation has become unavailable. The mule, for what it's worth, was considered by many experienced Westerners to be superior to the horse for sustained work in difficult conditions. The mule was stronger than a horse of equivalent size, hardier in its feed requirements, more sure-footed in rough terrain, and significantly less prone to the specific neurological spookiness that made horses unpredictable. The mule was also, as the working cowboys and the military units that used them extensively documented, stubborn in ways that the horse was not, refusing to do things it had assessed as dangerous or pointless, with a specific, immovable commitment that required skilled handling to manage. The ox was the other draft animal of the West, specifically the draft animal of the immigrant wagon trains of the 1840s to 1860s, and its advantages over the horse for that specific application were significant. Slower but stronger, able to eat the prairie grasses that the horse couldn't subsist on, cheaper to purchase, and more manageable for the inexperienced handlers, who made up most of the immigrant population. The ox's slowness was the cost. The ox-drawn wagon covered 15 miles on a good day, compared to the 25 to 30 miles of the horse-drawn vehicle. But for the sustained, heavy-load work of crossing the continent, the ox's endurance often outperformed the horse's speed. Chapter 4. The guns, the mythology, the reality, and why the difference could get you killed. The gun. We need to talk about the gun because the gun is the central prop of the Wild West mythology, the object around which the mythology's most distinctive narratives are organized, and the object whose actual reality in the 1876 West was so different from its cinematic version that getting it wrong was practically dangerous. The myth: every man in the Wild West carried a revolver on his hip, drawn with lightning speed in moments of confrontation, accurate at any distance, and producing the clean, decisive resolution of conflicts that the moral clarity of the Western genre required. The reality was more complicated in almost every respect. First, not everyone carried a gun. The working cowboy on the cattle drive typically carried a rifle or a shotgun for practical purposes. The killing of rattlesnakes, the dispatching of injured cattle, the occasional encounter with predators, rather than the hip-slung revolver of the Hollywood version. The revolver was carried when it was needed, and not carried when it wasn't, and the decision about when it was needed was made by people who understood the specific costs and benefits of carrying a weapon in the specific environment they were in. The towns of the Wild West, the actual towns, the Dodge cities, and the Tombstones and the Abilenes frequently prohibited the carrying of firearms within the town limits, for the entirely sensible reason that the combination of alcohol, gambling, and armed men produced outcomes that the town's authorities preferred to avoid. The Ordinance of 1876 in Dodge City required visitors to check their weapons at the marshal's office upon arrival, a requirement that the mythological version of the Wild West has largely forgotten, because the image of the gunfighter walking into the saloon with his iron on his hip is more cinematically satisfying than the image of him checking it at the door. The actual accuracy of the period's firearms in the hands of the actual users was considerably lower than the mythology suggests. The Colt single-action army revolver, the Peacemaker, the gun most associated with the Wild West, was accurate at close range in the hands of a skilled shooter. In the hands of an average shooter, the majority of the population, it was a weapon whose reliable accuracy extended to perhaps 25 meters, and whose performance under stress, at speed, in the specific physiological conditions of an actual confrontation. The elevated heart rate, the shaking hands, the tunnel vision of the fight or flight response was considerably below its performance at the target range. The famous quick draw, the ability to draw the revolver from the holster and fire accurately in a fraction of a second, was a specialized skill that required extensive regular practice to develop and maintain. The men who had this skill, the Wyatt Earps and the Wild Bill Hickoks of the period, the professional gunfighters whose reputations were built on documented confrontations, were men who had spent years developing it. The ordinary cowboy, the farmer, the merchant, these people could operate a firearm competently in the sense that they could point it at a target and hit something, but the lightning draw of the mythology was not part of their repertoire. The gunfight itself was not the civilized one-on-one duel of the Hollywood Western, the two men standing at opposite ends of the street, the signal given, the draw completed, the faster man surviving. Real gunfights in the Wild West were typically chaotic, close-range, multi-person affairs in which the participants were frequently drunk, frightened, or both, in which the results were often unclear until after the shooting had stopped, and in which the winner was not necessarily the faster draw, but the person who happened to be in the best tactical position when the shooting started. The gunfight at the OK Corral, the most famous gunfight in American history, and the event that crystallized the mythology of the Western gunfight, was a close-range shotgun and revolver fight that lasted approximately 30 seconds, involved 8 people in a space roughly the size of a large living room, and resulted in 3 deaths and 3 wounds. It was not a dramatic showdown between good and evil at high noon. It was a chaotic close-range confrontation between 2 groups of armed men who were on bad terms in a narrow lot in the middle of the afternoon. That was over before most of the participants had fully processed what was happening. The most dangerous firearm in the Wild West was not the revolver. It was the rifle, specifically the Winchester Model 1873. The lever-action repeating rifle that the period's advertising accurately called the gun that won the West. The Winchester's advantages over the revolver were significant: greater range, greater accuracy, greater stopping power, and the lever-action mechanism that allowed multiple shots to be fired quickly without the manual cocking required by the single-action revolver. The Winchester was the weapon that the experienced Western hunter, the cavalry trooper, and the man who expected to be in a serious confrontation actually relied on, and its presence in the mythology as the secondary weapon to the revolver's primary position is one of the many inversions of reality that the cinematic West produced. The ammunition problem was the practical dimension of gun ownership in the Wild West that the mythology almost entirely ignores. Cartridges for the period's firearms were not cheap, not universally available, and not something that could be replenished at the local gas station. The man who found himself in a situation where ammunition was needed and unavailable was a man whose gun was an expensive piece of metal, whose only remaining practical use was as a club. The care and maintenance of firearms in the conditions of the West, the dust, the humidity variations, the rough handling of working life, was a regular responsibility that the competent gun owner performed continuously. The revolver that had been exposed to the dust of the trail and not cleaned and oiled was a revolver that might misfire at the moment when misfiring was most consequential, and the specific frequency with which period accounts mention misfires and mechanical failures in confrontation situations suggests that the reliably functioning firearm of the mythology was somewhat more reliable than the reality it was based on. You have arrived in 1876 with the mythology. You have the image of the gunfighter's skill, the expectation of the cinematic accuracy, the assumption that the revolver on the hip is the solution to the West's problems. The West, which has been processing the claims of people who misunderstood it since approximately 1849, is not going to be impressed by your mythology, and it is not going to adjust its reality to accommodate your expectations. Chapter 5. The town, what the actual Wild West settlement looked like, and why it was harder than it appeared. You are still on the dirt street. Let's look at the town, because the town is where most of the Wild West's human drama actually happened, and the town of 1876 looked quite different from the town of the mythology. The typical Wild West town was small, genuinely small, not small in the sense of a modest community of several thousand people, but small in the sense of a few hundred people, a main street, and the specific collection of commercial establishments and residential structures that a few hundred people needed and could support. Dodge City, at its most famous period, the late 1870s, when it was the end point of the Chisholm Trail and the destination of the cattle drives from Texas, had a permanent population of approximately 1,200 people, swelling to perhaps double that during the cattle season, when the cowboys and the merchants and the gamblers and the various commercial and social operators that the cattle trade attracted arrived. The physical structure of the typical Wild West town was as provisional as the economy that had produced it. The buildings on Main Street were typically frame construction, wooden structures built quickly and cheaply from the lumber that the railroad was bringing west at a pace that the frontier settlement's demand required. The building that looked solid from the front, with its painted facade and its proper signage, was often backed by a structure of minimal depth. The false front building of the frontier town, whose impressive street-facing elevation concealed the fact that the building behind it was essentially a shed. The false front building was not dishonesty, it was the pragmatic construction practice of a settlement that expected to grow. The facade built to the scale of the town's ambitions, rather than its current reality. The structure behind it built to the scale of the current budget. The town that prospered would eventually fill in behind the facade. The town that didn't would leave the false front standing over whatever remained. The streets of the Wild West town were, as we established, unpaved, and the unpaved street of the frontier town in wet weather was a specific, memorable experience. The cattle town in the rain, with the heavy traffic of horses and wagons and cattle churning the unpaved surface into a mud of considerable depth and adhesive quality, was a town in which movement was measured not in miles per hour, but in effort per foot, and the specific physical challenge of crossing a 19th century frontier street in the mud was documented by every traveler who experienced it with the vividness that significant discomfort produces. The solution that the prosperous frontier town adopted was the wooden boardwalk, the raised wooden sidewalk that ran along the front of the buildings, elevated above the mud of the street, connecting the establishments along the main street in a continuous wooden pathway that allowed the pedestrian to move without the mud's cooperation. The boardwalk was one of the period's characteristic architectural features, and its presence or absence was a reliable indicator of the town's commercial development and self-regard. The sanitation of the Wild West town was, by modern standards, essentially absent. The privies, the outdoor toilets, the wooden outhouses positioned at the rear of the buildings were the period's toilet infrastructure and their management. In a town of even modest size, was a problem that the period's public health understanding addressed imperfectly. The privies contaminated the groundwater. The slaughterhouses of the cattle towns contaminated the streams. The garbage, the organic waste of a community of 1,000 people, was disposed of in the ways available, which meant dumped behind the building, left in the street for the pigs that many frontier towns maintained as informal waste management, or burned when the accumulation became impossible to ignore. The flies were the visible consequence of this sanitation situation. The Wild West summer town was a world of flies, the specific, comprehensive infestation of every food surface, every eating establishment, every exposed surface of any organic material. By the flies that the manure and the garbage and the slaughterhouse waste produced in quantities that the period's fly control was inadequate to address. The fly swatter was a real piece of equipment in the frontier town, used constantly with the specific futility of anyone who has tried to swat flies in an environment where the flies are being produced faster than they can be killed. The smell of the cattle town specifically, the smell that the trail's end produced when several thousand cattle were held in the pens waiting for the railroad to take them east, combined with the smell of the town's general sanitation situation, was documented by travelers with the vividness that only the truly remarkable experience of smell seems to produce in otherwise moderate writers. Abilene, Dodge City, Ellsworth, the cattle towns of the Kansas frontier, were places whose smell preceded them at a distance of several miles. The specific combination of cattle and manure, and the processing of cattle into the beef that the eastern cities were eating, producing an olfactory environment that the cowboys who arrived after the long trail from Texas described as familiar, and that the first time visitors described in terms that were somewhat more expressive. The commerce of the Wild West town was organized around the specific economic activities that the frontier produced. The general store, the mercantile establishment that sold the provisions, the tools, the dry goods, the ammunition, the various supplies that the frontier household and the working cowboy needed, was the most universal and most important commercial establishment of the period. The general store's proprietor was one of the town's most important economic figures, the person who controlled access to the goods that frontier life required and who extended the credit that frontier economics made necessary. The saloon was the other universal institution of the Wild West town, and it was significantly more complex in its actual function than the mythology's version of it. The saloon was simultaneously the town's drinking establishment, its gambling hall, its entertainment venue, its social club, and in many cases, its informal news exchange and business meeting space. The saloon of the mythology is a place where things happen to the protagonist. The saloon of history was a commercial institution that provided a range of services to a specific demographic, primarily male, primarily working class, primarily in the West for economic purposes. And that was as much a part of the community's infrastructure as the general store or the livery stable. The doctor was present in the better established Wild West towns, and the doctor's practice was as much about the injuries and illnesses of frontier life as it was about the gunshot wounds of the mythology, the broken bones from horse falls, the respiratory illnesses of the plains winters, the intestinal diseases of the frontier's water and food, the various infections and complications that the working West produced in quantity. These were the doctor's primary workload, and the gunshot wound, while not rare, was not the dominant feature of the frontier medical practice that the mythology implies. The doctor's medical resources were the medical resources of the 1870s, a period in which the germ theory of disease was just being established, in which antiseptic surgery was a new and contested practice, in which the drugs available were the drugs of the pre-antibiotic era. The frontier doctor, who treated a serious wound, was working with surgical tools that might or might not have been sterilized, in conditions of cleanliness that the frontier's sanitation infrastructure didn't support, with the specific uncertainty of a practitioner whose theoretical framework was in the process of being transformed by the science that was happening in the universities and hospitals of the East and hadn't fully reached the frontier yet. Chapter 6. The food. What you actually ate in the Wild West, and why it was nothing like what you expect. You are hungry. This is not a surprise, given that you have been on the trail since before dawn in the specific caloric deficit that sustained physical activity in hot weather produces, and the last thing you ate was approximately 6 hours ago. What is surprising, or rather what would be surprising if you didn't now know what you know about the Wild West's gap between mythology and reality, is what the food available to you actually looks like. It does not look like the steaks and whiskey of the Hollywood saloon. It does not look like the bountiful spread of the frontier homestead in the harvest scenes of the Western film. It looks like beans, a lot of beans, with some salt pork if the supply situation is good, some hardtack if it isn't, and coffee so strong that the spoon is in genuine danger of standing upright in the cup. The specific, nearly solid coffee of the chuck wagon tradition that the working cowboys of the cattle drives consumed in quantities that the modern cardiovascular establishment would find concerning. The beans of the working West were not a side dish. They were the primary protein source, the caloric foundation, the food that showed up at every meal in every situation, from the trail drive to the frontier settlement to the mining camp, and their centrality in the period's diet reflected both their practical advantages and the absence of competitive alternatives. Dried beans were cheap, stable in storage, caloric, and could be prepared with the minimum of equipment that the portable cooking arrangements of the West allowed. They were also, to put this as diplomatically as the intestinal reality permits, a food whose social consequences in the confined sleeping arrangements of the cattle drive bunkhouse were regularly documented, with the specific humor of men who found the situation funny and the specific resignation of men who found it inevitable. The chuck wagon was the catering operation of the cattle drive, and its importance to the drive's success was recognized by the cattle operations of the period in the most direct economic terms. The cook was the second highest paid member of the drive's crew, after the trail boss, and the disparity between a good cook and a bad one was measured not just in the quality of the meals, but in the morale of the crew that had to eat them for the 3 to 4 months of the drive from Texas to Kansas. The chuck wagon cook, called Cookie by the cowboys, a title that was used with a respect that the title's diminutive doesn't quite convey, was a specialist in the specific cuisine of extreme constraint. His kitchen was a wagon with a fold-out work surface and a collection of Dutch ovens, cast iron skillets, and the specific equipment of the open-fire cooking that was his only option. His pantry was the chuck box at the rear of the wagon, containing the dried beans, the salt pork, the coffee, the flour, the lard, the dried fruit if the outfit could afford it, and the sourdough starter that he kept alive through the drive with the specific care of someone who understood that the sourdough was the difference between biscuits and no biscuits, and that biscuits were not a luxury on the drive, but a morale necessity. The sourdough biscuit of the chuck wagon was one of the Wild West's genuine culinary achievements, the specific, almost theological skill of the cook who could produce light, hot biscuits from a Dutch oven buried in coals, in any weather, at any elevation, with the simple ingredients that the chuck box contained. The biscuit was the cowboy's bread, the starch component of every meal, and the cook whose biscuits were good had the specific reverence of the crew for whom those biscuits were one of the few, straightforwardly pleasant features of a very physically demanding existence. The sourdough starter itself was treated with the kind of care that a modern person might reserve for a pet or an important piece of equipment. The starter had to be kept warm enough to remain active. In cold weather, the cook might sleep with it to maintain the temperature it needed, and had to be fed regularly with flour and water to keep the culture alive through the weeks of the drive. The cook who lost his starter had lost one of the drive's most important assets, and the expressions used to describe this loss in the period's accounts suggest that the cowhand's opinions on the subject were strongly held. The cattle drive diet extended beyond beans and biscuits to include the specific protein sources that the trail's circumstances provided. The cattle being driven were not available for eating. They were the product being delivered, and their value was measured at the end of the trail rather than in the cook's Dutch oven. The cattle that died on the drive, through injury, through disease, through the various misfortunes of the trail, were available as beef, and the fresh beef of the recently deceased trail steer was a welcome change from the salt pork that was the drive's standard meat. The hunting that supplemented the trail diet was the other fresh protein source, the antelope and the buffalo that the drives encountered on the plains in the earlier years of the cattle drives were shot for food, with the practical approach of men who understood the nutrition that fresh meat provided and who had no reason to pass up an opportunity to obtain it. The buffalo in particular, and we will return to the buffalo in the context of the West's larger story, was a food resource that the drives of the 1870s could still access, though the systematic slaughter of the period was reducing the herds with a speed that the cowboys of the earlier drives had not anticipated. The town food was better than the trail food in the establishments that could make it so, and significantly worse in the establishments that couldn't be bothered. The restaurant of the Wild West town, often called an eating house, rather than a restaurant, a term that carried the French associations that the frontier found pretentious, served the food that the town's economy and its supply chains could support, which, in the better supplied Kansas cattle towns, meant reasonable beef, some vegetables from the local gardens, or the arriving supply wagons, and the baked goods of the town baker, who had set up an oven and was supplying the local demand. The beef was good, and this is one of the places where the mythology and the reality agree. The beef of the cattle country was genuinely excellent, the product of animals that had been walking and grazing for months and had developed the muscle and the flavor that the grain-fed beef of the modern feedlot doesn't quite replicate. The steak in a Dodge City eating house in 1876 was a real steak, cooked over a real fire, from a real steer, and its quality was one of the authentic pleasures of the frontier town that the mythology has not exaggerated. The vegetables were the problem. The frontier town's access to fresh vegetables was a function of the season, the distance from the nearest supply, and the specific logistical challenges of keeping fresh produce viable through the transportation networks of the period. The early settlers of any given frontier location ate through their transported dried vegetables within months, and then managed on whatever the local environment could provide, which, in the arid southwest and the northern plains in winter, was not much. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that we have discussed in previous scripts in the context of long sea voyages, was a recurring problem of the frontier settlement, particularly in the winter months, and in locations sufficiently isolated that fresh food was unavailable for extended periods. The frontier doctor who diagnosed scurvy in a miner or a homesteader in February was diagnosing a disease that the patient's diet had been working toward since November. And the treatment, fresh food, specifically the citrus fruit or the pine, needle tea, or whatever local vitamin C source the environment offered, was simple in principle and logistically difficult in a settlement that hadn't seen a supply wagon since October. The mining camp's food was the most constrained of the West's various food environments, and the accounts of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver camps, and the various subsequent mineral rushes document a dietary situation that the enthusiasm of the prospectors for the wealth they were pursuing had not prepared them for. The miner who struck it rich could eat well because money could buy the imported food that the supply wagons brought at prices that reflected the transportation costs. The miner who hadn't struck it rich yet, the majority at any given moment, ate the beans and the salt pork and the hardtack that the camp sutler sold at prices that also reflected the transportation costs and the specific irony of being surrounded by silver ore while unable to afford an orange was one that the mining camp literature occasionally captured. The water used for cooking was the water available, and the quality of the water available in the typical frontier location was the quality we have discussed. The coffee, made with whatever water the camp or the trail had access to, boiled to the temperature that reduced but didn't eliminate the biological content, was the specific treatment that made frontier water safer than it would have been drunk raw. And the coffee habit of the West was not merely a cultural preference, but a practical health measure. The coffee of the cattle drive was the specific, strongest possible version of the drink that its function required, a substance capable of waking up a man who had slept 4 hours in a bedroll on the ground and was expected to be functional before dawn. The proportion of coffee to water that the chuck wagon cook used was a proportion that the modern barista would consider an emergency rather than a recipe. And the result was a liquid that the cowboys who drank it described in terms that suggest they viewed it less as a beverage and more as a therapeutic intervention. The whiskey of the Wild West saloon was also not what the mythology suggests. The frontier saloon served whatever liquor the supply chains had delivered, which was typically a rough whiskey of variable quality and consistent potency. The specific quality variation of frontier whiskey was significant enough that the establishments that served genuinely good whiskey advertised it, and the establishments that served the other kind, the product of the traveling whiskey peddler, whose distillation practices were optimistic rather than rigorous, were known to the regulars in the way that the establishments that served good ale were known in the medieval alehouse trade. The specific consequences of bad frontier whiskey included the hangover that its congener content produced with a thoroughness that the higher quality product didn't match, and the occasional more serious outcome that the most aggressively bad frontier liquor was capable of producing in the drinker who had consumed enough of it. The temperance movement that was making inroads in the frontier towns of the 1870s and 1880s was not responding to an imaginary problem. The frontier saloon's relationship with the health and economic stability of its customers was genuinely complicated, and the reformers who argued that it was making things worse were making a case that had more evidence behind it than the saloon's defenders preferred to acknowledge. Chapter 7: The Cowboys. The reality of the cattle drive, and why it was nothing like the mythology. Let's talk about the cowboy. The cowboy is the central figure of the Wild West mythology, the free man of the open range, the rider whose skill and self-reliance and moral code of the frontier made him the defining American hero of the 19th century's imagination. The cowboy of the mythology is competent, laconic, handsome in a weathered way, loyal to his friends and implacable to his enemies, and at home on the range in a way that the settled people of the East, with their conventions and their compromises and their indoor lives, could only dream of. The cowboy of history was also a real person, and he was in many respects genuinely admirable. The skill, the horsemanship, the specific physical competence of the working cattleman were real. But the frame of the mythology, the free man of the open range, missed the economic reality of what the cowboy actually was. A low-wage agricultural laborer, doing one of the most physically demanding jobs in North America, in conditions that the mythology romanticizes, and that the participants themselves, in the accounts they left, described rather more honestly. The wages of the working cowboy in the 1870s were approximately $25 to $40 per month, roughly equivalent to the wages of a factory worker in the few eastern cities, for work that was considerably more dangerous, more uncomfortable, and more geographically isolated. The trail boss earned more, $100 to $125 per month. And the cook was, as we noted, the second best paid member of the drive, which tells you something about the relative valuation of culinary skill on the frontier. The cattle drive itself, the movement of a herd of longhorns from Texas to the Kansas railheads, was the organizing economic activity of the post-Civil War West, and it was not a romantic adventure. It was a 3-month job of sustained, often miserable physical labor, organized around the specific requirements of moving 3,000 head of cattle across 1,000 miles of terrain that the cattle had not crossed before, and that the cowboys were managing as much as driving. The longhorn cattle of the Texas range were not the docile, cooperative animals of the feedlot. They were half-wild, long-horned, independently minded creatures whose relationship with being driven in a specific direction by men on horses was tolerant on good days and actively hostile on bad ones. The specific challenge of the stampede, the event in which a portion or all of the herd decided simultaneously that they were going in a different direction, usually at speed, usually at night, usually in the worst possible terrain, was the cattle drive's most feared occurrence, and the event that cost more lives than any other single cause on the drives. The stampede was triggered by the specific spookiness of the longhorn in conditions that bovine psychology found alarming. The lightning storm, the sudden noise, the smell of predator, the specific, indefinable something that could cause 1,000 head of cattle to shift from rest to full gallop in seconds. The cowboys, whose job it was to stop the stampede, to ride alongside the running herd, to turn the leading animals gradually back into a circle that would slow and stop the mass movement, were doing this work at night, in whatever weather had triggered the stampede, at the speed of a running longhorn, in terrain they could not see clearly. The injuries and deaths from stampedes were a regular feature of the trail drive record. The cowboy whose horse went down in the path of the running herd, the rider who was separated from the herd and couldn't find the cattle in the dark, the man who was trampled in the confusion of the turning herd. These were the cattle drive's specific occupational fatalities, documented in the cattle company records and in the accounts of the trail bosses who wrote up their drives for the owners. The river crossing was the other specific danger of the cattle drive, the moment when the herd had to be moved across the rivers that crossed the trail routes, and the longhorns' relationship with swimming was the specific combination of ability and reluctance that made the crossing a logistical and physical challenge. The cattle that refused to enter the water, the cattle that turned back in the middle of the crossing, the specific churning chaos of several thousand animals in the water simultaneously. These were managed by the cowboys who swam their horses alongside the herd, who used specific techniques of cattle psychology to encourage the leaders into the water, who retrieved the animals that turned back before they could cause the reverse movement that would halt the crossing. Drowning was the cause of a significant number of the cattle drive's fatalities, and the accounts of river crossings gone wrong have a specific quality of chaos and helplessness. The cowboy whose horse was swept off its feet in a flooded crossing, the man whose cattle pressed him into the current, the rider separated from the horse in the muddy water, that the mythology of the fearless Western hero does not quite accommodate. The sleeping arrangements of the cattle drive were the bedroll on the ground, the specific piece of equipment that the cowboy rolled out on whatever patch of earth was available, regardless of weather, and slept in for the 4 to 6 hours that the night watch schedule permitted. The bedroll was a canvas tarpaulin wrapped around a collection of blankets, and its waterproofing was partial. Sufficient for the light rain, insufficient for the sustained downpour that the Great Plains weather regularly produced. The cowboy who was sleeping in his bedroll in a Texas thunderstorm was not sleeping in the dignified, photogenic way of the campfire scene in the Western film. He was sleeping, or trying to sleep, in a wet bedroll in the specific misery of someone who is tired enough to sleep through considerable discomfort and not quite tired enough to sleep through all of it, in the knowledge that the night watch would wake him in 2 hours for his shift, regardless of whether he had managed to sleep in the meantime. The night watch was the cattle drive's most exhausting requirement, the need to maintain a continuous human presence around the sleeping herd through the night hours, walking or riding the perimeter of the bedded cattle, singing softly to them in the specific way that the cattle drive tradition developed as the technique for maintaining the herd's calm. The night singing of the cowboy, the tradition of singing to the cattle during the night watch, is one of the genuine and remarkable customs of the period, born not from the romance of the open range, but from the practical discovery that a soft, continuous sound from a known direction was the most reliable way to prevent the cattle from startling in the dark. The songs sung during the night watch were whatever the cowboy knew. Hymns, popular songs of the period, the specific repertoire of the cattle drive tradition that developed its own corpus of trail songs over the decades of the drives. The night singing was not a performance, it was a functional act, and the cowboy who had a good voice had a specific professional advantage in the night watch rotation that the cowboy with a poor voice lacked. The racial composition of the actual cattle drive workforce was significantly different from the uniformly white crews of the Hollywood Western. Approximately a third of the working cowboys of the post-Civil War cattle drives were black, the formerly enslaved men and the freedmen of Texas who entered the cattle trade in the years after the war, and who brought to it the specific agricultural and animal handling skills that the plantation economy had developed. The black cowboy was a genuine, significant, and historically documented figure in the Wild West, whose systematic erasure from the mythology is one of the more consequential distortions that the Hollywood version produced. The Mexican vaquero, the working horseman of the Mexican cattle tradition, from whom the Anglo cowboy derived most of his techniques, equipment, and vocabulary, was the other, systematically marginalized figure in the Wild West mythology. The saddle, the bridle, the lasso, the spurs, the specific techniques of cattle handling from horseback. All of these were Mexican in origin, developed over the centuries of the Spanish colonial ranching tradition in the Southwest, adopted by the Anglo cattlemen who encountered the system and recognized its practical superiority. The words that the cattle trade used, rodeo, corral, lasso, bronco, buckaroo, ranch, and stampede, were Spanish words because the practices they described were Spanish in origin, and the Anglo-West West built its cattle industry on a foundation that the vaquero tradition had laid. Chapter 8. The Law. What justice actually looked like on the frontier, and why it was more complicated than the myth Wyatt Earp is not the story. The story of law and justice in the Wild West is one of the most comprehensively mythologized aspects of the whole subject, and the mythology's version, the lone lawman confronting the forces of disorder, the personal moral code expressed through the gun, the frontier justice that was rough but right, was a version that the period's actual legal situation only partially supported and largely complicated. The legal situation of the American West in the 1870s was a function of the specific provisional character of the frontier's political development. The territories that would eventually become states were, in the 1870s, in various stages of the transition from unorganized federal land to organized territory to state, and their legal infrastructure reflected this transitional character. The territorial courts were federal courts, staffed by judges appointed in Washington, who sometimes had no knowledge of the specific conditions of the territory they were assigned to. The county sheriffs and town marshals were local officers whose authority was local and whose resources were whatever the local tax base and the territorial legislature had provided. The resources were not generous. The marshal of a frontier town in 1876 was typically a man who had been given a badge, possibly a deputy or two, and the authority to enforce the town's ordinances and the territory's laws, with a salary that reflected the frontier's fiscal constraints and an institutional support system that consisted largely of the goodwill of the town's business community and whatever personal relationships the marshal had developed. The marshal's practical authority was also significantly constrained by the specific social dynamics of the frontier community. The town of Dodge City or Tombstone was not a city with an established legal culture and a population that had been socialized into compliance with institutional law over generations. It was a frontier settlement whose population included a substantial proportion of men who had come west specifically to escape the institutional constraints of the East, who had the specific independence of people, who had chosen to live in a place where the institutional infrastructure was minimal, and who had varying degrees of respect for the specific officials who were attempting to enforce the specific laws that the territory had enacted. The relationship between the marshal and the powerful interests of the frontier town, the cattle operators, the saloon owners, the merchants whose commercial interests were sometimes in tension with the law's requirements, was one of negotiated authority rather than simple enforcement. The marshal who enforced the law impartially, regardless of whose interest it served, was a marshal whose tenure was short unless he had the political backing to survive the opposition that impartial enforcement generated. The marshal who enforced the law selectively in ways that accommodated the powerful interests of his community was a marshal who lasted longer, but who was doing something other than what the mythology described. The Vigilance Committee was the community's extra-legal response to the inadequacy of the formal legal system, and it was one of the Wild West's most morally complicated institutions. The vigilante justice of the frontier, the committee of leading citizens who decided that the formal legal system was insufficient to address a specific problem and who took enforcement into their own hands, was sometimes the response to genuine failures of the formal system that had left serious criminals unpunished. It was also sometimes the response to the specific preferences of the powerful interests of the community, and the people who were lynched by vigilance committees were not always the people who deserved to be. The hanging was the frontier's primary form of capital punishment, applied through both the formal legal system and the vigilante system, and its frequency in the historical record of the West reflects the period's specific approach to criminal justice rather than the specific frequency of capital crime. The cattle thief who was hanged by a rancher's vigilance committee might have been guilty of the theft, or might have been a convenient target for a community that needed to demonstrate that it was serious about property rights. The distinction between these two cases was not always clearly established before the rope was applied. The specific legal vulnerability of the West's marginalized populations, the indigenous people whose land was being taken, the black freedmen whose rights were theoretical rather than practical, the Chinese immigrants whose legal status was systematically constrained, was the other dimension of frontier justice that the mythology obscures. The law of the Wild West was not applied equally, and the application of law to some populations was significantly more aggressive than its application to others, in ways that reflected the racial hierarchies of the period rather than the moral clarity that the mythology preferred. The fence-cutting wars, the range wars, the specific conflicts between the large cattle operations and the small farmers and homesteaders who were settling the rangelands that the cattle operations had been using as open range. These were the West's genuine legal dramas, the conflicts that the courts and the marshals and the territorial legislatures were actually occupied with in the 1880s and 1890s. The Johnson County War in Wyoming, the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, the fence-cutting conflicts in Texas. These were organized violence between economic interests, conducted with the specific brutality of conflicts in which both sides had enough resources to sustain the fighting and enough political connections to prevent the law from resolving it. The Lincoln County War is worth noting specifically because it produced Billy the Kid, one of the Wild West mythology's most enduring figures, and one whose actual history is considerably more interesting and considerably less morally simple than the mythology's version. Billy the Kid was a participant in a range war between competing cattle and mercantile interests, fighting on one side of a commercial conflict whose moral clarity was not the moral clarity of the innocent versus the guilty, but the moral clarity of two groups of men with guns pursuing incompatible economic interests. His status as outlaw hero was a product of the mythology making that the frontier press was already engaged in during his lifetime, and the historical figure was more complicated than either the hero or the villain that the subsequent tradition produced. The law's relationship with the saloon was one of the West's most practically significant legal negotiations. The saloon was both the source of the majority of the disorder that the marshal was required to manage and the source of a significant proportion of the tax revenue that paid the marshal's salary. The closed saloon was a lawful saloon, and the closed saloon produced no tax revenue and was also politically and commercially problematic in a community where the saloon's proprietors were among the most politically connected members of the business community. The management of this tension was the daily reality of frontier law enforcement in ways that the mythology of the principled marshal standing against the saloon's corruption doesn't quite capture. Chapter 9, The Other West, the indigenous peoples, the Chinese laborers, and the women whose stories. The mythology buried the Wild West was not a white man's story. This requires saying clearly because the mythology has been so comprehensively organized around the white male protagonist, the cowboy, the gunfighter, the lawman, the settler, that the other people of the actual West have been systematically pushed to the margins of the narrative, even when they were central to the history. The Wild West that actually existed was a place of extraordinary demographic diversity and extraordinary demographic inequality, and understanding who was actually there and what was actually happening to them is the difference between the mythology and the history. The indigenous peoples of the West were not the background of the Western story. They were the people whose world the Western story was, in its most fundamental historical dimension, about destroying. The period of the Wild West mythology, roughly 1865 to 1890, was the period of the final military campaigns against the sovereign nations of the Great Plains and the Southwest, the period in which the Lakota, the Comanche, the Apache, the Cheyenne, and the dozens of other nations whose territories were in the West were being systematically dispossessed of their land, their sovereignty, and in many cases, their lives. The Buffalo Soldiers, the black cavalry and infantry regiments of the post-Civil War U.S. Army, given the name by the indigenous warriors they fought against, were among the primary instruments of this dispossession, a historical irony whose complexity the mythology has almost completely failed to process. The black soldiers, who had fought for their own freedom in the Civil War, were deployed in the West to fight for the displacement of the indigenous peoples in the service of the white settlement that would not fully extend its legal protections to either group. The buffalo itself was the West's most significant ecological and military campaign, conducted simultaneously. The systematic slaughter of the American bison, the reduction of a population estimated at 30 to 60 million animals in 1800 to fewer than 1,000 by 1889, was the specific strategy that the U.S. government's military and civilian leadership identified as the most efficient way to end the resistance of the Plains nations, whose cultures, economies, and food systems were organized around the buffalo, with an integration that made the buffalo's disappearance, the disappearance of the world those cultures had, been built in. General Philip Sheridan's statement that the buffalo hunters were doing more to end the Indian problem than the entire regular army was not a confession of a policy accidentally aligned with genocide. It was a description of a deliberate strategy, openly stated, implemented through the commercial incentive of the hide trade that made the killing economically rational for the hunters, while making it strategically beneficial for the government. The Wild West mythology of the buffalo hunter as frontier entrepreneur, the solitary man with his Sharps rifle and his commercial independence, was the mythology of a figure who was simultaneously a private businessman and a participant in one of the 19th century's most consequential acts of environmental and cultural destruction. The indigenous peoples who survived this destruction were the survivors of a catastrophe whose scale the Wild West mythology has historically not been comfortable acknowledging, because the acknowledgement would displace the hero from the center of the story. The Lakota warriors at the Little Bighorn, who killed Custer's Column in June 1876, exactly in our period, exactly in the moment we've been describing, were not the aggressors of that encounter. They were the people defending the Black Hills, whose sacred significance to the Lakota had been confirmed by treaty and whose gold deposits had been confirmed by Custer's own expedition 2 years before, and whose defense of their territory was the military expression of the specific desperation of a nation that understood what was happening to them and was not going to submit to it without a fight. The Chinese laborers who built the Central Pacific Railroad, the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad completed in 1869, were among the most important workers in the construction of the infrastructure that made the Wild West possible, and they are among the most systematically absent figures in the mythology of it. Approximately 10,000 to 20,000 Chinese workers did the most dangerous work of the railroad's construction: the blasting through the Sierra Nevada, the crossing of the Nevada Desert, the specific physical challenges of building a railroad through terrain that the engineering of the period found at the limits of what was possible. The work was lethal. The nitroglycerin and the black powder used for blasting killed workers in numbers that the Central Pacific's management tracked as a labor cost rather than as a human tragedy. The cold of the Sierra Nevada winters, the heat of the Nevada desert summers, the specific dangers of the construction work, all of these killed Chinese workers in numbers that the historical record documents imperfectly, because the systematic documentation of Chinese worker casualties was not a priority of the people doing the documenting. The Chinese workers were paid less than their Irish counterparts, were housed separately, and worse, were denied the legal protections that white workers had access to, and when the railroad was completed, were the specific targets of the anti-Chinese political movement that produced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first law in American history to prohibit immigration on the basis of race and nationality, passed in the specific aftermath of the period whose mythology presents as the age of Western freedom and opportunity. The women of the Wild West were present, active, and comprehensively excluded from the mythology's central narratives. The homesteader wives who broke sod and raised children and managed farms in the specific, unrelenting isolation of the Plains frontier. The isolation that produced the psychological condition known as prairie madness, the breakdown of women who had come west with their husbands to lives of loneliness and labor, that the frontier's promotional literature had not accurately described were the West's majority female experience, and it was an experience of extraordinary difficulty and extraordinary resilience. The specific challenge of childbirth on the frontier was the medical reality of the West that the mythology most completely ignores. A woman in labor on the Kansas frontier in 1876, 30 miles from the nearest doctor, managed by whatever assistance her neighbors could provide and whatever medical knowledge the community had accumulated, was a woman in a situation whose outcomes reflected the medical reality of the period rather than the happy endings of the frontier romance novel. Maternal mortality on the frontier was significantly higher than in the established cities of the East, for the obvious reason that the medical resources of the frontier were significantly inferior. The women who ran frontier businesses, the boarding house keepers, the laundresses, the restaurant operators, the various commercial women whose enterprises were as essential to the frontier economy as the cattle trade, were operating in an economic environment that provided opportunities unavailable in the East's more constrained gender economy, while also providing the specific legal and social limitations of a society that had brought its gender conventions west, along with everything else. The saloon women, the dance hall girls, the entertainers, the women whose work in the frontier's entertainment industry placed them in the specific social category of the disreputable, were women whose stories the mythology has processed through the lens of the sentimental redemption narrative, rather than through the more complicated lens of the actual economic and social situations that produced their choices. Many of them were women who had come west for the same reasons the men had: economic opportunity, escape from constrained situations, the specific possibilities that the frontier offered to people who were willing to live in the discomfort that the frontier required. The frontier's gender imbalance, the significant excess of men over women in most frontier locations, created the specific social dynamics of a world where women's social and economic options were shaped by their scarcity in ways that the established East's more balanced demographics didn't produce. The frontier woman who wanted to run a business had customers in abundance. The frontier woman who wanted to marry had suitors in abundance. The specific power that scarcity conferred was real, within the limits of the period's gender conventions, and some women used it with considerable skill and considerable effect. Chapter 10. The Medicine. What happened when you got hurt or sick on the frontier? You have been shot, not fatally, or not immediately fatally, which in the 1876 West was a distinction with a meaningful gap between it and the outcome you actually wanted. The bullet entered your left shoulder, which is the good news relative to the various other anatomical locations it could have entered. The bad news is that you are on the frontier in 1876, and the medical infrastructure between you and the survival of this experience is a chain of circumstances whose every link requires things to go correctly. The first link, getting to the doctor. The doctor in the nearest town, if the nearest town is large enough to have a doctor, which not all frontier towns were, is however far away the nearest town is. If you are in town when this happens, the doctor is minutes away. If you are on the trail, the doctor is however many hours of riding with a bullet in your shoulder the nearest settlement represents, and the bleeding from the wound and the specific physiological consequences of a bullet wound. The shock, the pain, the potential for the bullet to have done things to the internal structures of the shoulder that the external wound doesn't reveal, are accumulating throughout those hours. The frontier doctor who treats your wound is working with the medical knowledge and equipment of 1876, which is a more complicated situation than it might appear. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that infectious disease was caused by specific microorganisms, and that the prevention of infection required specific measures to prevent those organisms from entering the wound, was in 1876 a relatively new and still contested scientific advance. Joseph Lister had published his work on antiseptic surgery in 1867, and the practice of antiseptic wound management was spreading through the medical profession. But its adoption was not uniform, and the frontier doctor in 1876 might or might not have been trained in antiseptic technique, and might or might not have the supplies that antiseptic technique required. The doctor who probes your wound with an unwashed finger to locate the bullet. And this was standard practice in the pre-antiseptic era. The surgical examination of wounds with the ungloved, uncleaned hand being the technique that the surgeon's training had taught him, is introducing the specific microbiological material of his hand into the wound with the specific thoroughness of a procedure designed for exactly this purpose. The infection that follows is not bad luck. It is the predictable consequence of the medical practice of the period, and it is the consequence that killed more people from bullet wounds in the 19th century than the bullets themselves. The survival rate from gunshot wounds in the Civil War, the most comprehensively documented medical experience of 19th century American firearms injuries, was significantly affected by the surgical practice of the period. The Union Army surgeons who amputated limbs with the speed that was the era's primary surgical technique for avoiding death from shock were performing these amputations with instruments that were cleaned between cases at best and not cleaned at all at worst. And the infection rate from Civil War amputations was high enough that the procedure that saved men from dying of the immediate wound often killed them from the subsequent infection. The frontier doctor had learned from the Civil War's medical experience, which was the most intensive medical training that American medicine of the period had received, and the better frontier doctors were aware of, and practicing the antiseptic techniques that Lister and his followers were promoting. But the equipment of antiseptic surgery, the carbolic acid solution, the clean dressings, the specific instruments and procedures of the antiseptic technique, required supplies that the frontier's supply chains didn't always deliver, and the frontier doctor who wanted to practice antiseptic surgery in the full Listerian sense was a doctor who was constantly managing the gap between what the technique required and what the frontier could provide. The bullet extraction itself was the procedure that the mythology has made iconic. The doctor with his forceps, the whiskey for anesthesia, the patient biting the bullet, and the mythology is approximately correct in its description of the procedure's awfulness. The anesthetic options available to the frontier doctor were limited. Chloroform and ether were both available and used, and the frontier doctor who had them and knew how to administer them was providing a genuine mercy to the patient under the knife. But the supply of anesthetics was not guaranteed, and the patient whose surgery was performed without them was experiencing something that the mythology's bite the bullet shorthand significantly understates. The pain of unanesthetized surgery was not the Hollywood version of pain, the heroic grimace and the clenched fist. It was the specific overwhelming pain of nerve tissue being manipulated by a probe and forceps in ways that the nerve tissue was not designed to accommodate, and the physiological response to this pain, the shock, the involuntary movement, the specific breakdown of the person's capacity to remain still while the procedure required them to remain still, was one of the practical challenges of frontier surgery that the surgeon managed through the speed we have discussed and through the physical restraint of the patient by the assistants who held them down. The ether and chloroform that were available when available were not administered with the precision of the modern anesthesiologist. They were administered by whoever was holding the soaked cloth over the patient's face, and the margin between the dose that produced unconsciousness and the dose that produced respiratory failure was narrower than the person administering it was always aware of. Anesthetic deaths in the 19th century were common enough that the choice between the risks of unanesthetized surgery and the risks of anesthesia was not straightforwardly obvious to the doctor making it. The post-operative care of the bullet wound was where the frontier's medical situation was most significantly inferior to what modern medicine would provide. The clean wound that had been properly closed and dressed needed to be kept clean, which, in the conditions of the frontier, The dust, the flies, the limited access to clean water and clean dressings was not straightforward. The wound that became infected, the redness and swelling and fever of the early wound infection, needed to be managed with the wound care that might involve drainage, cleaning, and the application of whatever the doctor had in his kit that had antiseptic properties. The antiseptics available to the frontier doctor were various and of variable effectiveness. The whiskey, that is the mythology's all-purpose medical solution, was a real antiseptic. Alcohol kills bacteria, but it was used for wound cleaning rather than for anesthesia in the better-informed medical practice of the period, because its effectiveness for anesthesia was limited, and its effectiveness for wound cleaning was real. The carbolic acid that Lister prescribed for antiseptic wound management was effective and available in the better supplied frontier practices. The various herbal preparations and folk remedies that the frontier's non-professional medical tradition employed were of variable merit, some of them genuinely effective and some of them actively harmful. The diseases of the frontier were often more dangerous to you than the violence, and they were less cinematically interesting, which is why the mythology has systematically underrepresented them. The cholera we have discussed. The typhoid that followed similar routes of transmission, contaminated water and food, was equally prevalent and equally lethal in the frontier environment where the sanitation that prevented its spread was equally unavailable. The smallpox that swept through indigenous and settler communities alike, that the indigenous peoples had no inherited immunity to, and that the settlers had only partial protection from through the vaccination that was available but not universally administered. This was the disease that killed more people in the American West than any other single cause. The vaccination against smallpox, Jenner's cowpox vaccine, developed in 1796 and increasingly used through the 19th century, was available on the frontier, but available is not the same as universal, and the vaccination rates in frontier populations varied with the specific public health infrastructure of the location. The mining camp or the cattle town that hadn't been vaccinated was a community with a specific, predictable vulnerability to the smallpox outbreaks that the traveling population of the frontier regularly introduced to new locations. The indigenous people's relationship with European diseases was the most medically catastrophic story of the entire period, and it had been catastrophic long before the 1870s. The epidemic diseases of Europe, smallpox, measles, influenza, had been reducing the populations of the Americas since the first contact, killing not randomly, but with the specific efficiency of pathogens, encountering populations with no inherited immunity. The population of the Great Plains nations in 1870 was already a fraction of what it had been before sustained European contact, and the epidemic diseases of the period continued to reduce it through the reservation system's specific combination of malnutrition, overcrowding, and inadequate medical resources. The dentistry of the Wild West deserves its own moment because the teeth of the period's inhabitants were a significant source of pain and health problems that the mythology's photogenic subjects consistently underrepresent. The dental care of 1876 consisted primarily of extraction. When a tooth hurt badly enough, it was removed with the tools and the technique that the period's dentistry provided by whoever was doing the dentistry, which on the frontier was often whoever had the forceps. The frontier dentist, who might be a trained dental practitioner or might be the barber who had invested in the relevant equipment, performed extractions without anesthesia in many cases, or with the whiskey anesthesia that dulled the edge of the pain without eliminating it, and the specific experience of having a tooth removed with 19th century forceps by a practitioner whose training varied from the highly skilled to the genuinely alarming was one of the West's standard medical experiences rather than an exceptional one. The teeth that weren't extracted, the teeth with cavities that had been left to progress because the pain had not yet become unbearable or the dentist had not yet been available, were the source of the chronic infections that could and periodically did progressed to the systemic infections that the pre-antibiotic era's treatment options were inadequate to address. The man who died of a tooth abscess on the frontier was not dying of a dramatic Western disease. He was dying of a dental infection that modern antibiotics would have resolved in a week, and his death was one of the more preventable tragedies of the period's medical situation. Chapter 11. The weather, the specific, comprehensive violence of the Western climate. We have established the summer heat. Let's talk about everything else. The American West's weather was not a single problem. It was a rotating set of problems, each season producing its own specific version of the climate's capacity to cause difficulty, and the experienced Westerner's relationship with the weather was the relationship of someone who had made their peace with the specific reality that the weather was always either a current problem or a pending one. The spring on the Great Plains began the tornado season. The specific meteorological conditions of the central United States, the collision of warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico with the cold, dry air descending from Canada over the flat terrain of the plains that provided no topographical interruption to the development of the convective systems that the collision produced, made the Great Plains the most tornado-prone region on Earth. The tornado season ran roughly from March through June, and the tornadoes it produced ranged from the brief, narrow funnel that touched down and lifted without doing more than impressive local damage to the mile-wide wedge tornado that stayed on the ground for an hour and removed everything in its path with the comprehensive efficiency of a natural disaster that didn't distinguish between the important and the unimportant. The warning technology available for tornadoes in 1876 was the human eye, and whatever the human eye could see of the developing storm, the specific warning signs that the experienced plainsman had learned to read, the greenish sky, the rotating wall cloud, the sudden stillness that preceded the storm, the distant roar that announced its approach, were the only warning available, and they provided a warning, time measured in minutes rather than the tens of minutes that the modern weather service's radar provides. The response to the tornado warning on the frontier was the storm cellar, the underground shelter dug into the earth beside the homestead, whose roof was at or below ground level, and whose earthen walls and earthen overhead provided the specific protection of mass and burial that the above-ground structure couldn't offer. The homesteader who had dug their storm cellar was a homesteader with a rational plan for the tornado. The homesteader who hadn't dug one yet, the newcomer, the person who had been meaning to get to it, was a homesteader whose plan was to run, which was a plan with a success rate that varied with the tornado's specific track and speed, and with the running speed of the person implementing it. The hailstorm was the spring's other agricultural catastrophe, the hailstones of the Great Plains storms could reach the size of baseballs, and a hailstorm that passed through a farming area could destroy a season's crop in 20 minutes, killing the wheat and the corn, and whatever else the farmer had planted with the specific, comprehensive destruction of precipitation that was too solid to absorb and too heavy to ignore. The farmer who watched a hailstorm move across their planted fields was watching their year's income being destroyed with no recourse, no insurance in the modern sense, and the specific personal relationship with financial ruin that the frontier homesteader maintained as a constant background awareness. The summer thunderstorm was the daily feature of the plains summer, that the heat built toward through the afternoon and released in the late afternoon or evening, the specific pattern of convective thunderstorm development that the plains' flat terrain and humid summer air produced with the regularity of a calendar. The lightning of these storms was one of the specific dangers of the open plains. The flat terrain with no natural lightning rods meant that the tallest object in the landscape at any given moment was the most likely lightning target, and in an open plains landscape during a thunderstorm, the tallest object in the landscape was frequently a person on horseback. The lightning deaths of the frontier West are documented in the newspaper accounts of the period with a frequency that reflects the specific geography of the danger. The open range, the exposed position of the working cowboy, and the trail drive, the absence of shelter that the plains provided for the person caught in the open when the storm developed. The cowboy on the night watch, who saw the lightning developing to the southwest and who had no shelter to run to was in the specific situation that the night watch rotation produced at least once per drive, and the management of the herd during the lightning storm, preventing the cattle from stampeding at the thunder while also managing the personal danger of being the tallest thing in the landscape, was the cattle drive's most simultaneously demanding experience. The flood was the spring and summer's other specific danger, the consequence of the thunderstorms that dumped their rain in the upstream portions of the watershed and sent the results downstream with a speed that the flat terrain and the unimpeded drainage of the plains accelerated. The dry creek bed that was a convenient campsite in the evening was a raging torrent by midnight if the right storm had hit the right place upstream. And the accounts of campsite floods, the sleeping cattle drive crew woken by the rising water, the specific chaos of men and horses and equipment in the dark water, were a standard feature of the trail drive literature. The flash flood of the Southwest was the specific sudden version of the flood danger. The narrow canyon or the dry arroyo that filled with the runoff from a distant storm in minutes, with no warning visible to the person in the canyon because the storm itself was over the next ridge and not visible from the canyon floor. The tourist in the modern Southwest is warned about this specific danger in terms that the frequency of its occurrence justifies, and the 1876 equivalent of the warning was the experienced person's knowledge of when not to camp in a canyon and when not to enter one, which was knowledge that saved many lives, and that the inexperienced newcomer frequently lacked. The autumn brought the northers, the cold fronts that swept down from Canada across the plains, with the speed that the flat, unobstructed terrain permitted, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees Celsius in hours and converting the pleasant autumn day into a winter emergency before the people caught in the open had time to find shelter. The cattle drive that was still on the trail in October was a drive in the specific risk zone of the norther, and the trail bosses who pushed their drives late into the season were making a calculated gamble with the weather that the calendar's financial pressure made rational and that the weather occasionally punished. The winter blizzard was the northern plains' most lethal seasonal feature. The storm that combined low temperature, high wind, and heavy snow into the whiteout conditions that killed by disorientation as much as by cold. The person caught in a blizzard on the open plains could not see the farmhouse that was a quarter-mile away because the blizzard's visibility was zero, and the quarter-mile might as well have been 100 miles for the practical purpose of finding it. The deaths from blizzards on the plains frontier were concentrated among the people who were outdoors when the storm hit. The traveler, the farmer checking their livestock, the child sent on an errand who didn't make it back. And the accounts of these deaths in the frontier newspapers of the period are accounts of people dying within sight of safety because the blizzard made sight impossible. The homesteader's response to the blizzard was the rope strung from the house to the barn, the lifeline that provided the tactile navigation that the visual navigation that the whiteout denied. The rope between house and barn was one of the Wild West's most practical, least glamorous survival technologies, the specific adaptation of a population that had learned what the blizzard could do and had developed the simple measure that kept the person checking the livestock from becoming the person who died between the house and the barn. The summer drought, the extended dry period that the plains' variable precipitation pattern produced at intervals, was the homesteader's slow-motion catastrophe, the gradual failure of the agricultural enterprise, as the lack of rain reduced the crops first, and then the water supply, and then the livestock, and then whatever remained of the household's economic viability. The 1880s drought that produced the agricultural disaster of the southern plains, the 1890s drought that emptied the homesteads of western Kansas and Nebraska, the specific patient violence of a climate that had been operating on its own schedule long before the agricultural settlement arrived, and that was not going to adjust its schedule to accommodate the settlement's needs. These were the mechanisms that ended the homesteading experiment for hundreds of thousands of people, and that the mythology, with its preference for dramatic violence over slow attrition, has never quite found the narrative form to do justice to. Chapter 12. the actual violence. What the real danger in the Wild West was and why it wasn't the gunfight. Let's establish something that will seem counterintuitive if your knowledge of the Wild West comes primarily from the mythology. The gunfight was not the primary cause of violent death in the Wild West. The gunfight, the ritualized, one-on-one confrontation between armed men that the mythology has made central, was real and documented and did kill people. But the number of people it killed in the actual historical record of the period was considerably lower than the mythology implies, and the other causes of violent death were considerably higher than the mythology acknowledges, because they were less cinematically interesting. The historians who have actually counted the documented homicides of the famous cattle towns, the Dodge cities and tombstones whose legends were built on the image of constant gunfighting, have produced numbers that consistently surprise people who expected more. Robert Dijkstra's study of the 5 major Kansas cattle towns found a total of 45 homicides over the cattle trade period. Not 45 per year, but 45 total, across all 5 towns, over the entire period of the cattle trade. Dodge City, the most famous of them, averaged approximately 1.5 homicides per year during its cattle trade years. This is not the Dodge City of the mythology. The Dodge City of the mythology has a gunfight approximately every episode. The Dodge City of the history had a gunfight approximately once a year in a town of 1,000 people, which made it roughly comparable to the homicide rates of many Eastern American cities of the same period. The Wild West was not uniquely violent by the standards of the 19th century. It was violent in specific documented ways that the mythology has amplified, and in other ways that the mythology has suppressed. The violence that the mythology suppresses was the violence of the extraction economy, the violence done to the land and to the people who lived on it in the service of the specific economic processes that the Wild West mythology celebrates. The violence of the cattle industry that was systematically displacing the indigenous peoples from their hunting grounds. The violence of the mining operations that destroyed landscapes and destroyed workers with equal indifference. The violence of the railroad construction that consumed laborers with the specific casualness of an enterprise that had calculated the cost of a worker's death as a line item in the construction budget. The workplace deaths of the Wild West were the West's actual leading cause of violent death, and they were deaths that the mythology has no interest in because they don't produce the hero. The cowboy who fell from his horse and was dragged by the stirrup and died from the injuries. The miner who was buried in the cave-in. The railroad worker who was killed by the blast that went off before he had moved to the safe distance. The homesteader who was killed by the farm equipment whose safe operation required the attention that the exhaustion of a 16-hour day had consumed. These were the deaths that the frontier West actually produced in the largest numbers, and they were recorded in the county death records and the newspaper accounts and the insurance claims of the period with the specific undramatic frequency of industrial accidents. The domestic violence of the frontier, the violence that happened inside households, between people who knew each other, the specific violence of the isolated homestead, where the combination of stress and alcohol, and the specific psychology of extreme isolation produced its outcomes in ways that the frontier's minimal law enforcement was inadequate to address, was another category of Wild West violence that the mythology has no narrative form for. The frontier household, where things went wrong, was a household far from any institutional response, and the outcomes of things going wrong were managed or not managed through the resources the household had, which were frequently insufficient. The violence against indigenous peoples was the Wild West's largest and most systematic violent enterprise, and it is the violence that the mythology has most comprehensively processed into the narrative form that justified rather than condemned it. The specific massacre, the killing of non-combatant indigenous people, including women and children, by military or civilian groups, appears in the historical record of the period with a frequency that the mythology's version of the Indian Wars doesn't support, because the mythology's version required the violence to be conducted against warriors rather than against families. The Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, the Marias Massacre of 1870, the Camp Grant Massacre of 1871, the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. The pattern these events reveal is not the pattern of military conflict between armed forces. It is the pattern of organized violence against civilian populations, conducted by groups with significant military advantages against groups with minimal capacity to defend themselves. And it is a pattern that the Wild West mythology has spent considerable effort processing into a different narrative form. The specific violence of the vigilante system, the hanging, the burning out, the organized intimidation of the communities that the Vigilance Committee had decided were problematic, was another category of Wild West violence that the mythology has sometimes celebrated and sometimes ignored, depending on the specific politics of the account being told. The Chinese immigrant communities of California and the mining towns were targets of organized anti-Chinese violence throughout the period. The Rock Springs Massacre of 1885, in which a mob of white miners killed at least 28 Chinese workers and expelled the rest from the town, was one of the larger episodes of a pattern of anti-Chinese violence that the frontier's law enforcement did not effectively address because the law enforcement reflected the political sympathies of the majority population. The actual danger of the Wild West, the actual thing that was most likely to kill you, was not the gunfight. It was the water, the disease, the weather, the distance from help when something went wrong, the specific, patient, indifferent violence of an environment that had not been designed for human occupation, and that was not going to become safer because you had a gun on your hip. Chapter 13. The End of the Wild West. What happened when it was over, and what it tells us. The Wild West ended in 1890. Not dramatically, not in a single event, not in the final gunfight that the mythology requires, but in the specific administrative way that the Census Bureau announced in 1890 that the frontier line no longer existed. The frontier, defined by the census as an area of population density below 2 people per square mile, had been the organizing concept of American expansion for 3 centuries. And in 1890, the Census Bureau found that the continuous frontier line that had been advancing westward since the colonial period had been filled in to the point where it no longer formed a continuous boundary. The frontier, in the official sense, was closed. Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, processed this announcement into the academic framework that became the foundation of American self-understanding for the following century. The argument that the frontier experience had created the American character, the democracy, the individualism, the specific qualities of the national identity that distinguished it from the European traditions it had come from. Turner's thesis was enormously influential and is now enormously contested, but its influence on the mythology of the Wild West was direct and significant. It provided the intellectual framework that transformed the historical experience of the frontier into the national myth that the mythology required. The mythologizing of the Wild West began before it ended. The dime novel, the inexpensive popular fiction that proliferated from the 1860s onward, was already processing the frontier experience into narrative form, while the historical events were still occurring, and the figures who became the mythology's heroes, Buffalo Bill, Calamity Jane, Wild Bill Hickok, were already managing their own mythological construction during their own lifetimes. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, the traveling entertainment spectacle that William Cody organized from 1883 onward, touring the United States and Europe with its staged reenactments of frontier scenes, its sharpshooters and riders, and theatrical representations of the experiences that the show's audiences were already learning to think of as the West, was the most direct instrument of the mythology's early construction. The Wild West show was not a documentary. It was a spectacle organized around what its audiences wanted the West to have been, and its enormous success was the success of a product perfectly matched to its market. the audiences of the industrializing East and Europe, who found in the mythology of the frontier exactly the alternative to their own constrained, urbanized, rule-governed experience that the mythology's freedom and violence and moral clarity provided. The performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show included the actual survivors of the actual events, the Lakota warriors who had fought at the Little Bighorn, performing for the audiences who had been told they were the savages of the Indian Wars. The specific, extraordinary irony of Sitting Bull, the Lakota leader who had been present at the Little Bighorn, who was the most famous living symbol of the resistance to American expansion, touring with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885, performing for the Eastern audiences who had been told a specific story about what he represented, is one of the Wild West's more remarkable and more unremarked historical facts. The photography of the period was the other mythology-making technology, and its role in constructing the visual vocabulary of the Wild West was profound. The photographers who followed the frontier, who documented the cattle drives and the mining camps and the frontier towns and the indigenous peoples, were producing images that were simultaneously documentary and aesthetic. And the aesthetic choices they made in selecting their subjects and framing their images were choices that reflected and reinforced the emerging mythology. The photograph of the Indian chief in full ceremonial dress, the headdress, the formal pose, the specific visual vocabulary of the noble savage stereotype, was not a documentary photograph of how indigenous people typically appeared or typically lived. It was a staged image, produced in the collaboration between the photographer's aesthetic agenda and the subject's understanding of what the photographer wanted and what the image was for. The photographs that the mythology drew from were photographs that the mythology had already shaped, and the circular reinforcement between the image and the narrative it served was one of the mythology's most effective self-perpetuation mechanisms. The Western film, beginning with Edwin Porter's The Great Train Robbery in 1903, barely a decade after the frontier's official closure, began the cinematic phase of the mythology's construction and set the visual conventions that a century of Westerns would develop, refine, and occasionally subvert. The Western was the dominant American film genre for the first half of the 20th century, and the vision of the Wild West that it produced was the vision of the Wild West that most of the world carries today. The vision that has been the subject of this entire script's patient, evidence-based correction. The Wild West of the mythology was not the Wild West of the history, but the mythology was not simply a lie, and dismissing it as false misses something important about why it was made and why it lasted. The mythology was the story that a society told itself about a formative experience shaped by the specific needs and anxieties and aspirations of the people doing the shaping. The need for a narrative of freedom in an increasingly constrained industrial society. The need for a narrative of moral clarity in a political culture that found moral clarity increasingly difficult to locate. The need for a national identity story that could unify a diverse population around shared symbols and shared values. These were real needs, and the Wild West mythology addressed them with a specific, powerful effectiveness that the more complicated history could not match. The mythology required the simplifications: the white hat, the black hat, the good guy and the bad guy, the clean violence that resolved the moral question. Because the mythology was performing a function that the accurate history couldn't perform, providing the story that the culture needed in the form that the culture could use it. Conclusion: you are still on the dirt street. The dust is settling, or not settling, because there's a wind coming from the southwest that is picking up the surface dust of the unpaved street and moving it in the direction of your face, with the specific indifference to your presence that the West's physical environment maintained throughout this script. The horse you arrived on is tied to the hitching rail outside the establishment that the mythology calls a saloon, and that the history calls a commercial drinking and gambling establishment whose primary business was the provision of liquor and entertainment to a working-class clientele. The establishment's smell is reaching you on the same wind as the dust. You would not last a day in the Wild West. not because you are insufficiently courageous or insufficiently capable, but because the Wild West was a specific, demanding environment whose demands were calibrated to the people who had grown up in it, trained for it, and accumulated the specific knowledge that surviving in it required, the horsemanship that the cattle drive demanded, the water knowledge that the desert crossing required, the medical knowledge that treating a wound in the absence of modern resources necessitated, the specific accumulated competence of the experienced Westerner. These were not native gifts. They were the product of years of experience in the specific environment, and you don't have those years. The Wild West would kill you with the specific patient indifference of an environment that was not designed for the unprepared. The heat would dehydrate you before the gunfight got the chance. The bacteria in the water would incapacitate you before the outlaws did. The horse that you don't know how to manage would throw you before the stampede had the opportunity. The distance between you and the nearest medical help when something went wrong would determine your survival more reliably than any gun on your hip. But here is what the complete account of why you wouldn't survive requires acknowledging alongside the practical argument. The Wild West produced people who did survive it, people who mastered the horsemanship and the water knowledge and the specific competencies of the frontier, because those competencies were what their lives demanded, and because the human capacity for adaptation to demanding environments is one of the more remarkable features of the species. The black cowboys who did their third cattle drive before they were 25, and who knew the trail the way the modern commuter knows their highway. The indigenous women who maintained their cultures and their knowledge systems through the catastrophe of the dispossession, and who are maintaining them still. The homesteader wives who broke sod and raised children and managed isolated farms in conditions that the promotional literature had not accurately described, and that they managed anyway. The Chinese workers who built a railroad through the Sierra Nevada with hand tools and black powder, and who survived the specific comprehensive dismissal of their contribution to the American West with a resilience whose historical record is only now receiving the attention it deserves. These people were in the Wild West, not because the mythology had told them it was romantic, but because it was where their lives were, and they navigated its demands with the competence of people who had no option but to be competent, and who rose to that specific requirement. The mythology that has replaced them with the white-hatted gunfighter is a mythology that serves specific purposes for specific audiences, and those purposes are not necessarily served by the accurate history. But the accurate history is more interesting than the mythology, because the accurate history contains all the people who were actually there. All of them, not just the ones the myth found convenient. And the full account of their experience is more complex, more various, more human, and more remarkable than the story of the lone hero at the end of the street has ever managed to be. The wind is still blowing from the southwest. The dust is still in your face. The horse is still at the rail. The Wild West, the real one, is all around you. And it is simultaneously less glamorous and more extraordinary than anyone told you.